to a transcendental cosmology. And this, of course, is going to prepare the ways for the Catholic Church, and the whole notion in Jerome and Augustine that we are born between, piss and shit, that the vagina is this abomination that's between these organs of excrement and urination. And I think St. Jerome said that, or was it Origen, that woman is a temple built over a sewer. So you get this whole attack on sexuality as prima facie evidence of the fall of evil. And the whole notion where Jesus had tried to have relations with women and Mary Magdalene, and in some of the Gospels that they kick out, he says, let the women in, that they carry the mystery as well, and Peter is trying to kick them out. And then Paul, when he comes in later, of course, completes the whole expulsion of women, that it's better to marry than to burn. So this whole notion, the esoteric quality of Jesus' relationship with women is just expelled into Gnostic texts, and the Church reinforces the geometrical mentality. And the geometrical mentality is one where everything is fixed. So Plato rationalizes the universe so that everything moves in concentric spheres, and any kind of sensory aberration to that, they find an intellectual way to save the appearances and to come back with concentric spheres. The model that develops out of that is the polity is, of course, an empire that has its center in Rome and its periphery where the Hicks and the resources are, so that Rome begins to be the Rome of first the empire and then the Rome of the ecclesiam. So the dominant model is very much articulated by Plato's Timaeus and the Aristeia, and these will rule the imagination for centuries. The climactic text of the geometrical mentality, beyond which you can go no further, I would say, is Dante's Divine Comedy, and that in the vision of concentric order of the Paradiso, you have the kind of sublime version where, as artist, he's trying to, in some sense, go back to the central problem of male and female and redeem the female by setting up the cosmic feminine in heaven with Beatrice. Now, Brahmsman in the University of Zurich says that men can only do this with women who've been dead, in our book, Over My Dead Body, so that she takes the picture of the German physiologist who's looking at this beautiful woman as a cadaver in the medical school and politely draped, and is about to lift her veil. She's very pretty on this slab, but he's about to move the sheet, but it's a 19th century drawing, so it's just covering her breast. But he's studying the phenomenon of sort of death in the maiden, but he's empowered because he's the doctor and she's just the meat, and so it's the familiar relationship of woman to the male gynecologist. So Brahmsman is trying to say that there is no, that men can only reconstruct the cosmic feminine when the woman is dead, and that this is a form of like the death of Novalis' sweetheart or the death of Beatrice. I actually am more sympathetic to Dante and think that actually Dante is really trying, as did the whole troubadours, are trying to recover precisely the cosmic feminine that was lost. And so that with the, what's the name of the woman in Ibn Arabi's poetry? I've forgotten her name, but there's a woman who's this kind of anima projection of divine knowledge that Ibn Arabi celebrates in his poetry. And in the troubadours and in the also in the Cathars, there was this whole attempt at the end of the geometrical Mediterranean mentality to recover and celebrate the feminine. Some of the literature that helped bring this in was, of course, Celtic with the Grail traditions, because in the Celtic traditions, women did not lose their power in the way they did in Central Europe. So the Romans were appalled at the Celts, and they said, you guys will never rule unless you dominate your women the way we do. And they were horrified at the power of Celtic women. Cuchulainn, the great hero, actually went to a guerrilla warfare school and studied the arts of war from a woman. And so the tradition of the west of Europe is quite different, and most of the traditions of the Grail, which is itself a yoni, a feminine symbol, are coming out of the Celtic tradition from Wales and Ireland. So part of the whole project, I think, of at the end of the Mediterranean cultural ecology is to try to recover the feminine, the Sophia, the destroyed feminine principle, and reestablish it cosmologically. And so I see the artists as actually doing, as writers often do, being obsessed with the feminine, trying to recover the feminine, trying to basically deal with the split in the culture. They lost, of course, because what the culture did was get into the Albigensian Crusade and kill them all, and then first they sort of denounced the Gnostics, and then when the church got power, it started killing people instead of just denouncing them. but the Albigensians were wiped out. And then these other traditions were considered heretical, and then things began to really pick up speed with expelling the Jews from Spain and starting up the Inquisition. And then after the Inquisition came the witch trials of the Holocaust of God knows how many millions of women were killed with that, and people who were psychic or sensitive or who had traditional knowledge were selected out for elimination. So I see these artists of the troubadour period coming back from the higher cultures of the Islamic world are trying to take what the songs and the music, the lute and Bach and some of these things are all coming from North African Islamic instruments. So the influence of Islam in poetry, and as Asim Palacios has shown, the whole cosmology of Dante is actually influenced by Ibn Arabi and by the Sufis. Ironically, though he puts Muhammad in hell, the closest thing to the Divine Comedy is actually Muhammad's night journey and descent through heaven and hell. I think it's called a mirage in Arabic. So it's funny that his influences are Islamic, and yet the text seems to be so dominantly Christian. But what you get with a climactic text is a finishing beyond which you can't go. It's a perfect vision of concentric order, all hung from the single prima mobile point at the top of the empyreum, everything in just ecstatic spirals of the white rose. And in this geometrical world, motion is definitely considered imperfect and is something that is to be suspected. When you come to the next mentality, then everything goes into doubt, and motion begins to be the very beginning of the mentality by which they say, okay, let's study ballistics and billiard balls and the movement of money through time with interest. And so the whole shift with the voyage poems in Descartes and the travel literature of Marco Polo and the rise of capitalism, that's a radical mentality in which what has been evil in the other mentality now begins to be the focus of attention. So a climactic mentality finishes it for all time, and beyond that, there's no place to go but into a new mentality. They're interesting to study these because they have a quality of perfection that they show when a new change is going to come in, it can't come from the center. You're not going to get a meeting of the College of Cardinals to say, you know, what we really need is a renaissance. It's going to come from marginality. It's going to come from a crazy guy like Mr. Flestone talking a lower echelon capitalist. Because in the Homeric cultures, as opposed to the Phoenician, the tradesperson is considered fallen in their caste system. So all the snotty remarks in the Homeric epics about the Phoenicians are that they're just considered brigands and pirates, and they're not really respected. Whereas in the Near Eastern cultures, trade is considered a respectable way of life and has a lot of prestige and wealth and power. So there's this split in the images between the Greeks and the Phoenicians. So motion is what's going to be the next, but the geometrical mentality is one that, as it finishes itself, it can't really imaginatively conceptualize what's going to be the next cultural ecology. So if you take Zeno's paradoxes of motion, that's the way a geometrical mentality is trying to understand motion, and there's no way you can explain limits and the calculus of infinitesimals with Zeno's paradox. It's going to have to take Newton and calculus to deal with it. So much the same way in our mentalities, we're at another one of these where we're trying to understand a new mentality, but there's no way you can do it within the mentality that's been our historical one. It takes a kind of rupture and a break into something that seems evil and chaotic and disruptive. So I think if one looks at these texts in this way, you can see that each mentality has a cultural ecology, the riverine, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and now the planetary or biospheric one. Each of these mentalities, each of these cultural ecologies generates a mathematics and a literature that articulates and forms it, develops it, and brings it to its peak. And the progression is an arithmetic to a geometrical, to a dynamical, to whatever you want to call the new one, morphologic or chaos dynamical. So basically, I begin and end where I started with Bach's Art of the Fugue, of the dum, 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 that the formative, dominant, climactic is, I think, another way to come at the history of ideas. It's one that doesn't require the kind of ethnocentricity Because when one's looking of the Western narrative, one's looking at the geometrical mentality, it's fairly universal, whether you're talking about Anyang and China up to the Forbidden City, whether you're talking about Indian palace culture, or you're talking about the Maya and the ceremonial centers of Teotihuacan. The geometrical mentality is hierarchical. It's structured with priests.